as ignorant, if not more, than I am. And so I thought, let me put it up on the website. And since then, we have grown to about 1,200 different data sets, and that's really the story.
So that's humanprogress.org.
That's humanprogress.org, yes.
And so that's something you started yourself?
Yes.
Is it?
I'm an employee of a think tank called the Cato Institute, but Burpees is an autonomous part of Cato. It runs pretty much autonomously. I have a lot of freedom to do whatever I want, and but most crucially, the information that we provide, the data itself is completely, it comes from third parties. We write articles, we write exclusive articles where we try to frame the data in the historical context. We try to get into the reasons why some countries are rich and why some countries are poor. We can talk about it as well. But we don't, so we do have an editorial position when writing articles and studies. We do not play around with the data, and anyone who comes to the website will see the original data taken from third sources, footnoted, sourced, and so on.
Okay, so let me hassle you for a couple of minutes, because I've talked to Matt and Ridley and to Bjorn, and so there's a group of people that are, and Steven Pinker for that matter, who are rational optimists, let's say, or intelligent optimists, or informed optimists. I got interested in this. I worked for the UN, for a UN committee for a couple of years, and I was reviewing books by the dozen on ecology and economics. And I was shocked. And what shocked me was things were way better than I thought they were, and they were getting better at a rate that was stunning, and I didn't know any of that. And it was overwhelming pouring through the data because I had been so wrong in my implicit presumptions. And so that's what got me interested in all of this. And of course, I was also extremely happy about it to see what was actually happening, how many good things were happening. So, but here's the criticism so I posted these talks with Bjorn, for example, and people have responded, often young people, and they say, well, they say something like this: that's all very well and good for you, Dr. Peterson, or Bjorn, you're 50 years old, you have a secure position, you grew up when the job market was stellar. It's much, much harder for young people to make their way in the Western world now than it was 20 years ago. That sort of security, long-term security, isn't there. And so you can look at these global trends and extract out some positive information from them, but that just gives you license to ignore the on-the-ground problems that so many young people are either facing or feel that they're facing in the West. And so, what do you think about that? What's the right response to that?
I think that young people have had terrible 20 years in Western countries. We have gone through the 9/11 crisis, followed by the financial meltdown. We had the Iraq War, then we had the COVID pandemic, and data shows that young people specifically seem to be disproportionately affected and very unhappy and anxious and so forth. So I would divide my answer into two parts. The first part is that it is always good to, there's an economist, Richard Lyman, I think his name is, who said, always compare yourself downwards, not upwards. In other words, that's the cost, or rather that's the way to happiness is to compare yourself downwards rather than upwards. By that, what I gather he meant is that even though things are very tough for young people still have access to the best healthcare in the history of the world. They have access to more security than any other people who come before them. They have access to education that in many cases is free and plentiful. And so it's important to realize that while some things have not been doing well, there's a lot in terms of life in advanced societies, which is still worth appreciating and being aware of. The second part, yeah.
Oh, sorry, please continue.
And the second part of my answer would be to say that it is all the more important for young people to understand the economic and political reasons why the West grew at faster rates before, why it had more political and social stability before than it has today. Young people are very blasé on average about politics. They don't generally vote. They tend to embrace all sorts of causes which are inimical to progress and to growth, such as, for example, socialism. They tend to be much more open to it than people who are older and turn more conservative. And so delving deeper into why the 1980s and the 1980s and the 1990s had high rates of economic growth is not a bad idea from the perspective of young people.
Well, it's also not exactly clear what baseline is being used when the claim is made that things aren't as good or as easy as they once were. I mean, they're certainly a lot better now than they were in 1820. They're certainly a lot better than they were in 1930 or 1940, probably 1950. Then there was a period of incredible growth in the 60s, in particular, the post-war period, where employment was a relatively straightforward matter for many people. Well, and there was plentiful, long-term, secure jobs. Now, how difficult it was in the 60s to obtain one of those is still an open question. Many people were much less educated than they are now. It isn't clear, it isn't absolutely clear to me that things were any easier any time in the past, and it's certainly the case that for most of the past, things were immeasurably worse.
Yeah, when I said that they had terrible 20 years, what I meant is that the last 20 years almost seem like a state of constant crisis. But let's disaggregate this experience that young people had. If you are a black person in the United States, for example, you have never lived in a safer, more tolerant, and more accepting society. If you're a gay person in the world, again, in Western society, you have never lived in a more tolerant or a more accepting society. If you're a woman, the same goes for you. So that's already well over 50% of the population. Also, let's not forget that whilst the wages of certain people in the United States, certain sections of the labor force have been stagnating, overall, the median household income in the United States prior to COVID was at a record high, which is to say that compared to the earnings of the median household in the 1970s or 1980s, American earning power prior to COVID was at an all-time high. So it's not true that people were poorer. Now, let me make one last point about this. When it comes to cost of living in America, which is what a lot of people are talking about, it very much depends on what you are looking at. Mm-hmm. Cars are cheaper by 70% than what, relative to wages than what they were 20 years ago. Toys, TVs, food, all of those are much cheaper than what they were 20 years ago relative to wages. Even housing, most people don't know this, but it happens to be true. Housing in the United States is 10% cheaper than it was 20 years ago relative to wages.
Now that would exclude high demand cities, I would imagine, right?
This is in every.
Because more and more people want to go to more and more exclusive and wealthy places, or fewer and fewer exclusive and wealthy places. So that's a complicated. Like in Toronto, the real estate market, housing prices are just skyrocketing constantly. And my sense of my sense of that is that there's 20 cities in the world that are optimal places to live, so they're scarce, and this is one of them. And people are quite mobile, and there's quite a lot of money, and so that drives real estate prices here continually upward. And you see that in New York, you see that in the major European cities that are highly desirable, you see that in San Francisco. But there aren't many places like that, so that's part of the reason for that.
That's absolutely right. Both things happen to be true at the same time. The 10% decline in the price of housing is average across the United States, whereas in the high demand areas it has also skyrocketed. Now in some places, like for example Manhattan, where a lot of young people want to live, there's only so much that you can do in order to provide additional housing because it's an island. However, in many other places in the United States, housing is artificially restricted. The building of new housing is artificially restricted through NIMBYism, through zoning rules, and so forth.
Yeah, it's I see it. We don't allow you to be poor here. You can't afford it. It's against the law because of the zoning laws, and that's a real problem in places like San Francisco.
And the two areas which have seen a massive appreciation in price, well above inflation, well above wages, is healthcare and education. Now,
And education is a particular burden for young people.
right. And now, would it be crazy of me to suggest that young people, instead of blaming the market or asking for free education, look at the reasons why education is so expensive? Could it be that because governments push so much money out of the door through Pell Grants and other heavily subsidized loans, the universities know they can charge much more money than would otherwise be the case? Could that be the reason why education is increasing the price? Could it be?
Well, I also think the universities, in some sense, have conspired to rob their students of their future income.
Well, look, imagine that you come to a car store and there's just one car left, and you say to the salesman, I really, really, really have to have this particular car. This would be Yale, Harvard, whatever. And by the way, I have $1 million in my pocket. How much is the car salesman going to ask you? $1 million. And it's a very similar situation when it comes to higher education. Universities know exactly how much they're going to pay. They know exactly how much money we get out of government in loans, because they need to check out the prices. And in healthcare, what's happening, of course, is that only 10 out of every 90 cents spent on healthcare in the United States is spent by people themselves, by patients themselves. The rest is spent by governments at different levels of governance. It's spent by third parties, by insurance companies. So when you walk into into a doctor's office and he asks you, do you want to have 10 or 20 blood tests?
No, you guys.
It's funny, I'm not paying for it anyway. And that's part of the reason, again, why healthcare has exploded but between those two, I can see why Americans would be quite dissatisfied with their standards of living. And I'm afraid that a third reason why Americans are going to be dissatisfied with their standards of living is coming down the pipeline. And I think that is going to be a massive increase in energy costs in the United States, just as it happened in Europe. In Europe now, they have a term called energy poverty. So even in places which are at the height of economic development, like Britain and Germany, people are not heating their homes in the middle of winter. People are washing themselves in lukewarm water because prices of energy have been artificially, by government fiat, jacked up to prices where even the richest people in the world, I mean as a population, as a share of population, can't afford things which are the essence of what life should be like in the Western civilization. And what it means is that some of those proposals that have taken on in Europe and which are making Europeans so miserable are going to come down to the United States and to Canada.
Okay, so let's draw some quick conclusions, and then we'll go talk about the 10 major trends. And so correct me if I've got any of this wrong. it's very difficult to make an informed case that things are worse now in almost every way than they were at any other time in the past, including the last 2 decades, but certainly going back before that. Things are better on almost every possible measure. People don't know that, partly because we have a negativity bias. We're attracted by negative information, and that's what is put forth by a media hell-bent on attracting our attention at any cost. We're also deluded to some degree by our historical ignorance and also by anomalies in the economic scheme, exceptionally high prices of housing in high demand, high quality areas, and the same thing happening, say, with university education, despite the fact that maybe state university education is still quite cheap, or community college, that kind of thing.
Hey, it's Michaela again. Hope you're enjoying this episode. Another quick word from our sponsors. This time about life insurance from Ladder. Last year, when we were trying to find competent doctors to save my dad, life insurance came up. Yeah, I'm bringing that into an ad. It was stressful not having it at the time. Life insurance from Ladder gives me a lot of peace of mind knowing my family will be taken care of. Given the luck my family seems to have with health, life insurance, especially term coverage, is extra important on this side of the pond. Ladder makes it impressively fast and easy to get covered. You just need a few minutes and a phone or laptop to apply. Ladder's smart algorithms work in real time, so you'll find out instantly if you're approved. No hidden fees, cancel anytime. And since life insurance costs more as you age, now is the time to cross it off your list. Life insurance is something to look into, and it's cheaper the sooner you start. So check out Ladder today to see if you're instantly approved. Go to ladderlife.com/JBP. That's LADDER life.com/JBP. Enjoy the episode.
Because of this pervasive negative message that's being put forward constantly, that also encourages us to exaggerate the degree to which the current condition is bad and getting worse. We don't know, and we assume that, and that makes us more miserable than we have any reason to be. The danger in that is that we're going to fail to appreciate and work to undermine all sorts of things that are actually working very well if we only could see the facts on the ground.
That's exactly right, and there's one message that I would like to pass on to the young followers who are having a tougher time than we expected for young people to have. Things could be much worse if the basic underpinnings of what made Western society rich and prosperous, which is to say liberal democracy and some form of free market capitalism, free enterprise, if those two are eroded or destroyed, we are in for a much tougher time. If you want to see how young people, how a society can deteriorate, go to Venezuela. It's not that far away, it's a couple of hours from Miami, and see how young people live there. Now, Venezuela was a country where in the early 1950s, GDP per capita was higher than in the United States. Today, people are eating cats and dogs and slaughtering animals in zoo for meat. Young women have no other option but to prostitute themselves to prostitute themselves. Men have gone into crime. It is basically a failed society. Not long ago, some of the leading lights of American progressivism, such as AOC, have been singing the praises of 21st century Venezuela socialism. So things could get much worse, and they will if we forget the lessons of history and if we don't understand that political stability to the extent we still have it is a result of liberal democracy, limited government, and the outcome and the reason for economic growth and the reason why we have all the nice things that people in Venezuela have is because we have free markets, free enterprise, and free trade.
Okay, let's But you'd also think it's kind of strange that in our proclivity, let's say, to devour bad news, you'd think that the story of Venezuela would get a lot more coverage than it actually gets. So that's kind of, maybe we can return to that. Let's go through the trends here. So the first one, so the book is structured so that on the right-hand page, there's a graph showing progress across time or change across time, a variety of different trends, let's say. The first one, the first trend is the great enrichment. And tell us what that means and what it signifies.
So the chart, which we maybe will show at some point, looks like a hockey stick. We used to say that for all our recorded history, let's say going back 4000 BC, but we can estimate even further back in time. The hockey stick of human prosperity. The line is flatlined. It is estimated that prior to the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the world economy grew by 0.1% per year, which is to say that to double your prosperity would have taken thousands of years. As late as 1900, which is to say the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, when Victoria was on the throne, the globe produced roughly $3 trillion in output. This is all inflation adjusted, so $3 trillion in output, the entire globe. In 2018, it was $121 trillion. So from $3 trillion to $121 trillion in a scope of 100 years, adjusted for inflation. And if the growth that we have experienced, the growth rate that we have experienced over the last 100 years continues into 2100, the world will produce $600 trillion in output, real inflation-adjusted output. Over the next 80 years, the globe could produce 6 times more value than it is currently producing if we maintain the current economic growth rate.
And do you think that's an optimistic projection or a conservative projection?
That's what leads us back to the original point that we discussed. It very much depends on economic policies and political stability. If you don't have civil wars around the world and government change hands in a peaceful and predictable way, then we should be okay when it comes to political stability. When it comes to economics, we are seen as surprising and, to be quite frank, surprising and almost inexplicable. Renewed interest in more restrictive economic policies, from socialism on the left to hardcore protectionism on the right. And if our economic growth rate falls from 1.82% that we have experienced over the last year to 0.1%, which we have experienced over the previous 10,000 years, then it will take us 6,000 years to get from $100 trillion to $200 trillion.
So the most remarkable thing about this is exactly the hockey stick shape. It's, as you pointed out, nothing at all happened until the mid-1800s, essentially, and then all of a sudden things improved so rapidly that it's virtually incomprehensible. It's a miracle.
It is the most important question in economics. What happens in the late 1700s, early 1800s that produces that hockey stick effect? And just to clarify, there have been in human history periods of economic efflorescence, flourishing, but they were usually restricted to small parts of the world, and they usually petered out. So, for example, Song China has produced some remarkable technological discoveries, and it appeared to be a time of relative plenty compared to other countries in the world. But that petered out when Song dynasty was replaced by the Ming dynasty. Similarly, the Roman Empire appears to have been a place that was largely at peace internally and quite prosperous, but that came to an end in 467 or whenever that happened. when Rome fell. So there are these periods that you can have prosperity. Also, let's stay with Europe. I mean, Europe has experienced the greatest century of peace and prosperity between 1814, the end of Napoleonic Wars, and 1914, the breakout of the First World War, which slaughtered tens of millions and destroyed a lot of wealth. So, you know, economic progress can certainly take a knock, and it can take a time to recover. But in order for it to recover, you have to rediscover the reasons why you had high economic growth rates in the first place.
Oh, okay, so the first lesson is that something happened in the last 150 years that propelled human productive capacity and distribution globally into the stratosphere. And there's no sign that that's slowing, although we could disrupt it. And we could disrupt it partly because we don't exactly understand why it happened, and we're not appreciative enough of its miraculous nature and the perhaps fragile preconditions for its continued existence.
Well, when I said that it's the biggest question in economics, I'm not suggesting that there aren't theories of why it happened. The theory that I espouse, the theory that has convinced me, is that over hundreds of years, in Western Europe and in North America, and then later in other parts of the world, our economic and political institutions have grown more inclusive, open, or to use a political word, now I'm using liberal in its European sense, not liberal in the current American sense. And what that meant was that you no longer needed a permission from the king in order to open a shop or import a bag of wool from another country.
So there's an autonomy, and there's an element of autonomy, but there's also an element of generosity, that autonomy leads to increased productivity, but the consequences of the production are also being shared. And rather than hoarded, they're being distributed reasonably well.
Yes, but the key here was, I think, that monarchies, governments, have become more responsible to their people, more accountable to their people, and they started allowing a much greater level of economic freedom. Now, the reason why that happened is a very interesting one. Once again, I'm going to tell you a theory that I espouse, and the theory that convinced me. Other people may have other ideas. But basically what has happened is that unlike in other parts of the world, such as the Ottoman Empire and such as China, Europe never had an internal empire. One dynasty was never able to conquer different European states into the creation of one European mega empire. And because governing elites of different states, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Holland, Belgium, whatever, because they wanted to survive, because they didn't want to be vassals of another monarch, because they wanted to remain independent, they realized that they needed to generate a lot of economic growth internally, and they realized that the only way that they could generate economic growth was through technological innovation. And technological innovation can only get into in societies which allow people a relatively great degree of intellectual freedom. And so countries that felt at most threatened, such as Holland, because the French were always trying to take them over, would welcome into their cities and into their country thinkers from all over the world, free thinkers from all over Europe, who established themselves there, produced new ideas, produced new technologies, and hoped to defend itself against the predation of other countries. England was another example of how this happened. So it is through geopolitical competition, in other words, the dismemberment of European countries.
Thank you.